These are crimes. You know what's going on in this country right now? Is that the CDC has been captured by the pharmaceutical industry.
This is what we get when I investigate.
We thought vaccines would return us to work. No, the wounds of vaccine divisiveness will take years to heal. The vaccines are not what we think they are. They meet FDA's definition of gene therapeutics. They could need 15-year studies for cancer, autoimmune, and other concerns.
I am seeing an uptick in cancers. I'm seeing these odd, stable cancers take off like wildfires after the vaccines.
We should have tested these for cancer-causing potential before we started giving them to our kids.
Our soldiers are being experimented on, injured, and sometimes possibly killed.
I've had patients that haven't been bathed, haven't been fed, haven't been given water, haven't been turned. And if you ask me, this isn't a hospital, this is a concentration camp.
That's right.
Another thing that patients in the hospitals and their families were denied was the basic human good of burying the dead.
They isolate you like a prisoner, give you remdesivir and dexamethasone, and then you die.
This warning says, FDA cautions against the use of hydroxychloroquine in outpatients outside of the hospital setting. But then, in the justification, it says, we base this on information to treat hospitalized patients. Hospital disease, as we'll hear, and as we know from 2 years of dealing with COVID, is a completely different illness treated with different drugs, different medications in the hospital. Outpatient disease is flu-like. Hospital disease is a florid pneumonia. And so the fact that the FDA would base recommendations and warnings on hospital disease, which is a totally different disease than outpatient disease, is a fraud. This website is still there today and constitutes an outright fraud, okay? This basically scared everyone across the country against using this on the basis of this fraudulent website.
I'm really tired of watching the U.S. health system's failed response to this pandemic. I cannot list, and I do not have the time today to talk about the innumerable failed policy responses. Things like, if you guys remember, not testing the vaccinated. Things like not recommending vitamin D, not checking vitamin D levels. I mean, things that are so fundamental, basic about science and medicine, and that they've been avoided. And I have to say, I'm going to call it out, and I'm known for this. I call it like I see it. I'm calling attention to the corruption. If you look at these innumerable failed policies, there's only one way to understand them. They are literally written by pharmaceutical companies. Almost every single policy serves the interest of a pharmaceutical company. However, if you look outside the United States and look around the world, there have been numerous successes. As one of the world experts on ivermectin, let me just talk about some programs which used ivermectin. My colleagues here, as Dr. Risch just pointed out, there are a number of compounds that we've identified that are effective in early treatment. Almost all of them are repurposed or generic. United States Health Agency structures and policies created over the last 50 years have tightly intertwined the pharmaceutical industry with public health institutions, resulting in repeated policies placing pharmaceutical industry interest ahead of the welfare of U.S. citizens.
As a scientist, it's quite baffling to me that we have an avalanche of data showing that it's the spike protein that causes the deleterious effects of COVID. All right? So, but we don't see any problem with putting genetic material into the cells of our body that tell it to make tons and tons of spike protein.
African Americans have double the mortality of non-African Americans, and the mortalities all happen in the hospital. Are African Americans, are they denied early treatment in the community?
Well, yes, they are. My dad just died. Right? He died Friday. Couldn't get a test, couldn't get monoclonal antibodies. We treated him at home. Unfortunately, we had an oxygen machine that didn't work. So his blood saturation went down to the point where he was incoherent. We called EMS. They said, your problem is your oxygen machine doesn't work. They put oxygen on him. He went to 98% saturation. We moved him to the hospital. He recovered all his cognitive functions. He was doing quite well, but he was no longer getting medications that reduce his inflammation. He was no longer getting medications that blocked the histamine response. He was no longer getting the medications that he needed, and he was no longer getting lung steroids, and he just declined and declined and declined until he passed away on Friday, and I say he passed away from lack of appropriate care.
Yeah, thank you.
Did you have no right to insist that your father was treated as a practicing physician?
I'm not a physician. I'm a PhD.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. So, but you had no right as a family member.
No, they said
insist
these
that-
are our
that-
protocols, and this is all we'll do. I mean, we asked for those things specifically. In my father's case, things went fairly quickly. First, they told us we'll send him home tomorrow with oxygen. Then they changed their story, and we asked for particular medications, and they said those weren't part of their protocol. They could not give them to us.
A patient that his wife reached out to me. He's trapped in the ICU, father of 6, sheriff's deputy. Refused to give anything, but these hospitals give them low dose steroids. They give them 6 milligrams of dexamethasone, 3 times a day. A lot of these hospitals won't even give breathing treatments. It's ridiculous. They won't give them the vitamins. And so basically she called me in desperation, and I testified. She sued the hospital to try to get her husband the medications he needed. I testified, we won. The hospital refused to grant me privileges, even though I have a spotless record.
The PALM study group investigated 4 drugs for the use of Ebola. The results were published December the 12th, 2019 in the New England Journal of Medicine. And that date is particularly important because that signaled the beginning of COVID. The Data Safety Monitoring Board of that study terminated the study of remdesivir. Terminated because remdesivir increased the risks of death and renal failure. It was such a toxic drug, the Data Safety Monitoring Board terminated the use of remdesivir. Yet, in January and February of 2021, the NIH and the ACT-1 study enrolled patients in a study looking at remdesivir for the treatment of COVID-19. The last patient was enrolled April 19, 2020. 10 days later, before the study had actually terminated, Dr. Fauci sat in the Oval Office of the White House, and he said the trial was good news. What Dr. Fauci did not tell you was that the primary endpoint of the study was changed halfway during the study. We all know that is scientific misconduct. Because the study was not going to be positive, they changed the primary endpoint. The original endpoint was an 8-point ordinal scale that included death and a requirement for mechanical ventilation. Knowing that remdesivir would not affect those endpoints, they invented a bogus endpoint called time to recovery, which they showed in this study was statistically significant. And based on this bogus endpoint, remdesivir was approved by the FDA on October the 20th, 2020. If you look at the 4 independent studies, including the large study by the WHO, it shows the opposite effect. Remdesivir increases the risk of death. Let me say that again. Remdesivir increases the risk of death by 3%. It increases your chances of renal failure by 20%. This is a toxic drug. But just to make the situation even more preposterous, the federal government will give hospitals a 20% bonus on the entire hospital bill if they prescribe remdesivir to Medicare patients?
Healthcare systems, spurred by perverse payment incentives from CMS, Dr. Merrick averred to just one of those, there are several others, caused our healthcare systems to focus narrowly on one single disease. This had the effect of, for example, biasing our COVID hospitalization and death counts. We've heard quite a bit about that in the media in the last couple of weeks, but people in this room have known about that for 2 years. We effectively abandoned patients that were suffering from other conditions and had other medical needs. The disastrous fruits of this myopia include an unprecedented 40% increase in all-cause mortality among working-age adults 18 to 64 over the last year, most of which, 2/3 to 3/4, depending on the state, was not related to COVID. Actuaries tell us that a 10% rise in all-cause mortality is a once-in-200-year disaster. This was a 40% rise. Our public health establishment has no answer for what caused that. The ethical principle of free and informed medical consent, guaranteed by the Nuremberg Code, the Helsinki Declaration, the Belmont Report, commissioned by our own federal government, the Common Rule in federal law. This basic principle of medical informed consent was abandoned, for example, when vaccine mandates required experimental EUA vaccines. The common good argument to get vaccinated in order to protect others quickly fell apart with clear evidence that the COVID vaccines do not prevent infection or transmission of the virus. Yet these one-size-fits-all mandates for vaccines remained. Transparency, which is a central principle of public health ethics, was likewise abandoned. Along with several colleagues, some of whom are in this room, I had to file a FOIA request to obtain the Pfizer vaccine clinical trial data from the FDA, which the FDA is required under federal law to release on the day in which this vaccine was authorized. The agency came back saying that it wanted 75 years to release this data, the data for the vaccine that had been mandated for millions of Americans. Data that took the FDA only 108 days to review. Fortunately, the federal judge just ordered this data released in 8 months. Thousands like me have lost our jobs for declining a novel injection whose safety and efficacy data still remains hidden. My firing from the University of California, where I served for 15 years, my entire professional career as a professor in the School of Medicine and director of their medical ethics program, came shortly after I challenged the constitutionality of the university's vaccine mandate in federal court, a case that's ongoing. The scientific method also suffered by a repressive academic and social climate of censorship and silencing of competing perspectives that we've heard a little bit about already. I certainly experienced that at the university. This projected to the public the false appearance of a scientific consensus, a consensus that was often very strongly influenced by economic or other political external interests. Finally, our government and public health authorities have still not defined the thresholds for this state of emergency that is renewed every 3 months. The supposed legal justification, this state of emergency, this public health emergency, for all the burdensome COVID countermeasures, right, a term that's emerged in the last few months with the militarization of public health. This is not a medical term. Physicians, scientists don't talk about COVID countermeasures. But these COVID countermeasures, the infringements on our civil liberties, the censorship of dissenting voices, all justified supposedly in the name of a public health emergency, the criteria for which has never been clearly defined. The assumption of emergency powers by both elected officials and unelected bureaucrats therefore continues indefinitely, with no end in sight, without any critical scrutiny or appropriate checks and balances.
If there is risk, there must be choice. Dr. Cariardi has just shared the legislative and ethical background for that, nicely summarized. Informed consent based on full disclosures of risks is an absolute necessity for any medical procedure. You all know this. When you go to the doctor, if you have a medical procedure, you go to the surgeon, they describe the risks, benefits, and allow you to make a choice. This is particularly so in the case of products used under an emergency use authorization. In contrast, Omicron is highly infectious, readily affects those that have been vaccinated, is generally associated with mild disease, and rarely, if ever, causes death. Mandating these vaccines makes no sense and is completely inconsistent with the core principles of Western bioethics, developed since the Nuremberg trials and codified in federal law as the federal common rule.
We thought vaccines would return us to work. No, the wounds of vaccine divisiveness will take years to heal. The vaccines are not what we think they are. They meet FDA's definition of gene therapeutics. They could need 15-year studies for cancer, autoimmune, and other concerns.
We know that in response to MMR, William Thompson at the CDC was a whistleblower that said African-American boys who got the MMR on time, again, these are RNA vaccines, and we know, again, RNA viral vaccines, live viral vaccines, we have the data to show how they are affecting the immune system, and that data showed that they were 2 to 3 times more likely to get an autism diagnosis if they were vaccinated on time, right? William Thompson alleges they then shredded the data. It's meant 20 years later from the first study, and we have not addressed the fact that not all of us are the same, and we need individualized medical care.
The lockdowns themselves are harmful to population health. The lockdowns have created a crisis in the mental health of the population in the United States and elsewhere. In July of 2020, after only a short amount of lockdown, 1 in 4 young adults in the United States reported seriously considering suicide. It's also affected physical health. For instance, people who were, many people skipped cancer screening, many people skipped even treatment for heart attacks and diabetes. All of these effects on the use of preventive medical services will have long-term consequences on the health of the population. On children, the lockdown in many, many states led to extended time away from school. And we know from an extensive literature that this leads to enormous damage to the health, long-term health, wealth, and well-being of children, especially poor children were affected by this.
I am supportive of vaccines that are properly developed with the proper duration of follow-up, with the proper safety testing. These vaccines have not, children should never get these vaccines. But what we should have done.
Omicron has enough mutations. The backbone of it actually looks more like a pre-Wuhan virus from a genetic point of view. It is behaving like a common cold. If you get a shot in your arm, you don't have a tendency to, everybody hears about antibodies, but there's a special kind in your tears, your nose, your mouth, called secretory IgA. It's little mops in your tears. If you've had a natural infection, you have high levels of secretory IgA, these little mops in your mucosal membranes, and that mops up virus quickly. The virus, the response from the vaccine, you don't get this physiologically. So we are seeing actually the vaccinated carry a high volume of virus because they don't have this secretory IgA. So this false construct from our federal agencies that this is a pandemic and the unvaccinated are spreading is a pathophysiologic lie. The vaccinated are carrying high volumes in their nose, their tears, their mouth of virus because the vaccine does not neutralize in that location of the body where the virus comes in.
There's evidence that Omicron is associated with a higher risk of infection in the vaccinated population, and that increased risk is a function of the number of vaccine doses that one has received. If we continue to pursue this universal vaccination strategy in the face of the pandemic, particularly with Omicron now, a much more highly infectious, highly replication competent virus, what we risk is the driving the virus through basic evolution to a state where it may be more pathogenic and more able to elude the immune response. If we continue to pursue universal vaccination, the high probability is that what we will continue to see is the evolution of additional escape mutants that are increasingly infectious and may well become more pathogenic. This policy of forced universal vaccination is absolutely contrary to all of our understanding about basic viral evolution. We are clearly seeing the development of escape mutants that are resistant to the vaccine. Omicron is not only resistant to the vaccine, but its infectivity seems to be facilitated by the vaccine. And in my opinion, this must stop for the sake of the world.
And the PCR threshold, the number of cycles, each cycle amplifies the signal once. So we go from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32, and you get to the point where you have a lot of amplified virus. So you need to have that cycle set low enough that you're only getting virus. Because if you have it set really high, if there's no virus there, it's going to amplify something, and you're just going to amplify garbage.
I want to point out two very important studies that show either 88% or 77% protection from natural immunity, and the studies were performed by Pfizer and Merck.
In terms of masks, and I know Steve will speak eloquently too, we pulled together 150 studies published in the Brownstone, and we could say this. When we looked at all of the comparative studies, there are just two RCTs, which is one is the Danish mask study, and that had a problem to be published. That shows basically that the masks are ineffective in terms of curbing infection. There was one RCT, cluster randomized, out of Bangladesh. It went from zero effect to about a 13%, very modest reduction in risk. The body of evidence, and I speak as an evidence-based medicine specialist, the entire body of evidence tells us conclusively that the blue surgical masks that we've been using and the white masks, the man-made masks, are largely and highly ineffective. They do not stop transmission, and every single place in America that we looked at with the globe where you impose a mask mandate, the actual infections increase.
There are only two randomized studies that have been done for masks and COVID. And they looked at cloth masks and surgical masks. And in both studies, there was zero effect. So the most recent one was the Bangladesh study. And what we did is we got a hold of the original data set that was used for the paper, and we did the graphs. There is no difference at all between wearing a cloth mask and not wearing a cloth mask. The curves were identical, and they misrepresented it in the study as showing that it works. If you actually look at the data and you plot the data, and you can get the data because it's publicly available, you will find that the curves are identical. There is no difference. The only mask that is proven to work is the one that they don't tell people about and that nobody wears. This is the only mask that works.
I'm a little reluctant to even have you talk about it because I'm afraid the Biden administration just might allocate about $100 billion to send those out to everybody.
Yeah. But here's what it's like. So you put this on like this, and then you strap it, and then you talk to people just like this. And this will filter it out. But there's a
I'm afraid they're going to require that for air travel. So,
but one important thing is that this mask works only in one direction. It will work to protect you,
but not somebody
But there's no filter on the outside, because if it was filtered on the outside, you wouldn't be able to breathe.
Right. Okay.
So it works, but it only works one way. And if they were really serious about protecting the American public, they would require everyone to wear this, in which case everyone would rebel and we would have no mask mandate.
Swedish study by Ludvigsen, and he was canceled because of this study. He looked at the 1.95, I think you mentioned it.
1.8, I thought.
1.9 million Swede kids across the entire pandemic, from 0 to 16 years old, all in primary school, secondary school. And what they found was that there were 0 deaths in Sweden in children. And what was critical about that study was that there was no lockdowns, there were no school closures, and there were no masks. It was not even testing whether you had masks and it worked. There were no masks and there was 0 deaths. And that was an actual seminal study.
So there's 0 randomized controlled trials that show masks stop the spread of respiratory disease. And that's including N95.
Well, the NIH tells you to go home, take fluids, take Tylenol, and you stay at home until you get blue and you can't breathe. And then you go to hospital, and then they isolate you like a prisoner, give you remdesivir and dexamethasone, and then you die. That's the NIH recommendation.
What had happened in this country, and I have to call it out, is, again, I use the words absurdity and obscenity. These are crimes. You know what's going on in this country right now? Is that the CDC has been captured by the pharmaceutical industry. The CDC has intervened and have manipulated the doctors. I need to make that message clear to all physicians in the land. These are highly effective medicines. They're not being used. The pharmacists are not filling. All the pharmacists in the land, you have to understand that you are obstructing the good and sound conduct of medicine. It has to stop. It has to stop. We have people dying.
We have shown the golden window to treat COVID-19 is the first 72 hours. And the patients that I have lost, and they've been very few, but if people listen to this out here, they will recognize that it's a late start at treatment that is, in a sense, the failure of early treatment. If we start early, we have uniform successes. I've reviewed hundreds and hundreds of reports of hospitalized patients and of those who've died of COVID-19. And in those reports, the clear observation is the determinants of hospitalization and death are the lack of early treatment.
But the question begs the risk-benefit ratio. That's really what we're getting at. Is there a risk for these low ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine? I always tell people, yeah, hydroxychloroquine's got so many side effects, like Dr. Parks talked about. Lowers the cholesterol, lowers the hemoglobin A1C, lowers the glucose, lowers the insulin resistance, lowers D-dimer, C-reactive protein, SED rate, decreases stroke, heart attack, pulmonary embolus, decreases chronic kidney disease. So there are a lot of side effects associated with these drugs. So that's one. I don't want to finish.
He's being very facetious. Those are all benefits.
There are now 96 clinical trials going on at clinicaltrials.gov for use of hydroxychloroquine in cancer, so solid tumor. So if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, that's where you're going to see. So these drugs have a lot of side effects. They're really, for the most part, wonder drugs, and they can cause side effects. Jokingly, I was being facetious earlier, and you can compare those the ones that have been developed by Pfizer and Merck. One's a molnupiravir, which is a nucleoside analog, and I want to go into this because I think it's important. These are not creative thoughts. These are old drugs from the 1950s that have been dressed up and put back out there, and they are going to kill viruses because viruses use the same machinery we do, but they'll also kill your mitochondria, they'll also kill your normal cells. They're actually not too bad at killing cancer cells, anything replicating quickly. So we are seeing the use of Paxlovid, which is like a Kaletra 2.0. So we are seeing drugs sort of being dressed up and repurposed. They are repurposing themselves and putting a price tag on them. They are using repurposed drugs with a higher price tag. Everyone needs to know that.
The NIAID division of the NIH co-owns the patent on the Moderna vaccine, and 6 members of the NIAID get royalties from the profits into their personal pockets, not to mention the entire budget of that program.
Are you sure of that?
I'm sure of that.
Is that
It's publicly available information. Okay. Rife with conflicts of interest that would never be accepted in other settings. So they are profiting. And look, NIH, just for people out there that don't know, where these agencies are situated in the federal government. NIH, which is gotten involved in sponsoring the research, the studies, for approval of the vaccines. FDA, which is the agency that gives approval, and CDC, which is the agency that makes recommendations on which subsequent mandates are based. So the CDC says, well, we don't mandate anything. We don't make federal policy, federal law, which is true, right? But all the mandates then look to the CDC recommendations as their justification. So nobody ultimately takes responsibility for the mandates. There's no place where the buck stops. All of these are divisions of the same Department of Health and Human Services. They all report to the same secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. And the need for strict separation from those who are profiting from these products, right? Which is what we expect corporations to do. Of course, that's what they're about. But all the more need for careful structures to be put in place such that the regulatory agencies are serving the interests of the American people.
Then there's also a revolving door between the agencies and the pharma. I mean,
Exactly.
And I won't name any names, but we've seen it in the
You can
recent
trace
past.
their careers as they rotate through these agencies into pharma and back. I have a patient, went to her rheumatologist, specialist in her autoimmune condition. This specialist told this patient, I don't think you should get the COVID vaccines, given your age, your low risk of COVID, and I think there's a good chance that these vaccines, based on the data that we have, could worsen your underlying medical condition. She turned to the same physician immediately afterwards and said, can you write me therefore a medical exemption? Because I need one for work. There's a vaccine mandate at work. Same physician that just told her not to take the vaccine or recommended against it said, no, I'm sorry, I can't write you a medical exemption because I'm afraid I might lose my license.
Are you telling me that patients who have known life-threatening contraindications
That's
to
right.
receive a COVID-19 vaccine indeed are not being given exemptions?
So the medical boards are behaving very irresponsibly, doing the bidding of governors who want to impose certain mandates, in this case, mask mandates or vaccine mandates. They're not serving the public good, in this case. They are certainly not serving the interests of patients. And they are, again, in my entire 18 years of being a licensed physician, I and my colleagues have never, ever received any kind of communication like this from the medical board. It's outlandish.
And to your point, Dr. Cariotti, they never define. They threaten you, and it's this looming threat without definition. You're spreading misinformation. Oh, do cite the papers in which I am spreading misinformation. They will not define it. They will attack you. They will threaten you. They will put you in a state of fear and say, you can only do what we say, but don't save a life. And by the way, the vaccines are expired because Omicron is here. And now they still want to mandate them. So they threaten us and threaten us and threaten us, and we're hunted for caring and being compassionate and empathetic and wanting to help humanity.
I'm Brianne Dressen. I participated in the clinical trial for AstraZeneca here in the United States last November. I experienced an extreme reaction that has changed my life. Even though I am sitting here before you today, I feel like I'm being electrocuted 24/7, and I can eat about 6 things, and my body feels like it's made of glass. And
By the way, you're also paralyzed from the waist down for a length.
Yes. So I was hospitalized. I was paralyzed from the waist down. I was incontinent, and because of this, because I cried while I was in the ER when my legs weren't working, I was diagnosed with anxiety. So I was sent home with intensive physical and occupational therapy due to anxiety, due to the COVID vaccine. But I was later able to go to the NIH and receive appropriate diagnoses after 7 months, neuropathy, POTS, things that are not anxiety.
Yeah, and my name's Kyle Warner. I'm a professional athlete, mountain bike racer, and I was injured by the Pfizer vaccine with my second dose. I developed the heart inflammation, POTS, and then a little bit of mast cell activation syndrome, which has also made it so I have limited things I can eat without just a big inflammation cascade. I've also asked my primary care physician for an exemption 4 times. She's not able to write me an exemption. I live in Boise, Idaho, and the St. Al's network there basically told her, under no circumstance are you allowed to get an exemption.
I'm listening to my colleagues call out all of the inanities, the insanities, the absurdities Okay, these departures of our policies from what we know are to be scientific truths. These things like denial of natural immunity. We have to understand why. To sit here and point fingers and they're doing this wrong and that wrong, why are they doing this? There could be multiple reasons. The simplest and most easily understandable and provable is every vaccine, these novel patented high cost drugs is profits. They're putting profits ahead of patients. We can call attention to all of these policies. They are non-scientific. They're failing at having scientific support, yet they're being carried out and they're being distributed across the country. And doctors and states and health departments are willingly accepting these without question, without critical thinking. And that's what I want us to be clear that we're calling attention to today. This is corruption. Plain and simple, it's corruption. Sorry.
I want to echo Dr. Corey's statement and say that it didn't start now. Many people have been fighting this corruption for many years. When they did the 1986 Vaccine Injury Act and said that manufacturers no longer have liability for any vaccine that's on the childhood schedule exploded. Now, I'm not saying every vaccine is or isn't safe on that schedule, but I'm saying that's when they said we have the perfect business model. Every kid has to take these vaccines if we put it on the schedule, and we have no liability. And so the schedule exploded, and safety corners were cut because we have no liability. And suddenly we started to see you have to have HPV for school. You have to have this for school. You have to have that for school. And so this business model, the more they pushed it, the more they realized no one pushed back because of this sort of idea that vaccines were always a positive health intervention. And so now we've gotten to the point where the mass formation psychosis around vaccines always being a positive health intervention has gotten us here.
I want to point out that the CDC and academic medical centers will say, and they will go to a home base, that they will say that the vaccines are associated with a reduction in hospitalization. And this will come up. The CDC in the last few days said there's 5 more papers showing the vaccines, even with Omicron, are associated with the reduction in hospitalization. But it's only in U.S. hospitals, not in South Africa, not in Germany, not in Denmark, not in the UK, and not in Israel. Americans should be asking the question, why are the vaccines only working against hospitalization, but they don't work against binary occurrence of the respiratory illness or reduced spread? And they don't reduce mortality, but why do they only reduce hospitalization? And by the way, they reduce hospitalization in most studies in the United States by 85%. How does that happen? That is basically academic fraud. And the reason why it is because these hospitalizations are not adjudicated. They're not telling us why the patients are hospitalized. And we've had multiple officials come out and tell us that 40 to 60% of people coming to the hospital who test positive for COVID are not there for COVID. Yeah. So we have a trumped up set of numbers. And to make matters worse, our CDC has advised consistently that the unvaccinated get lots of testing and the vaccinated actually refrain from testing. So the combination of not adjudicating hospitalizations and this asymmetric testing is creating a fraudulent data scheme in order to make the claim that the vaccinations are associated with reductions in hospitalizations when in fact they're not.
This constant refrain that Dr. McCullough just pointed out to is that everyone in the hospitals is unvaccinated. I believe that is manipulated data, and it's done, again, for the same purpose that I keep talking about. They want to vaccinate. Every vaccine brings profits. I believe that they are artificially, with great purpose, they are hiding the fact that many people in American hospitals are vaccinated.
I was using our protocol to treat critically ill patients in the ICU with a whole host of repurposed drugs. This is a memo sent to the entire healthcare system, but they targeted me personally. And what did this memo say? This said, I can use remdesivir, and then I will quote, there was an added section, do not endorse section, which includes medications that may cause harm and efficacy is not supported in peer-reviewed published RCTs. These medications will not be verified or dispensed for the prevention or treatment of COVID. This list includes ivermectin, bicalutamide, etoposide, fluvoxamine, dutasteride, and finasteride. And then just to stick it to me, they added ascorbic acid. This is the document which was sent to the entire healthcare system, which is the COVID-19 Comprehensive Treatment Guideline, which specifically was targeted at me, preventing me from prescribing safe, effective, off-label drugs. It's unprecedented in the history of medicine. The hospital is telling me how to practice medicine. They're denying me the right to use safe and effective drugs and lying because they claim
You can use safe, effective, off-label drugs for other conditions outside COVID.
Absolutely. If this was pneumococcal pneumonia, this wouldn't be an issue. This is specifically for COVID. Hospitals have become dangerous places for sick people. Patients must do whatever they can to avoid the hospital. When they are imprisoned in a hospital, they denied their rights. They are not allowed a patient advocate. Their family are denied access to the patient. They are prisoners in the system. They have no rights, and they get the treatment dictated by the hospital.
Another thing that patients in the hospitals and their families were denied was the basic human good of burying the dead. I don't know if folks are aware of this, but in the early days of the pandemic, a theoretical risk that maybe a corpse maybe might somehow, even though it contradicted all known science on respiratory viruses, somehow still spread COVID. This is a very weird paranoid thought. Caused many health departments, with the support of the CDC, to refuse to give the body back to the family. The bodies were incinerated, basically, and they would give you the ashes, whether or not whether you wanted a burial or not. One of the most painful conversations I had in the hospital, as the head of the ethics committee, I had a lot of conversations with families whose loved ones were dying of COVID, and this was a case of a patient irretrievably, at that point, dying of COVID. The family had finally come to accept that difficult reality that the patient wasn't going to survive the hospitalization. And then they asked about help for funeral arrangements, and the social worker told them, no, I'm sorry, we can't give your loved one back to you. We can't give the remains back to you because the health department won't allow it. So this theoretical, nonsensical risk that obviously turned out to be false anyway, was placed above that basic human good of burying the dead. No sane society in the history of humankind since the days of Antigone has ever done this to people.
It's been a fraud from the beginning, and I don't understand why, but to go to just one more quick thing, the NIH, the CDC, and the FDA are not involved in medical education. We went through a residency of medical school, a residency program. We have colleagues, mentors, people that we rely on. I've seen 300,000 patients. I've never called the FDA, the NIH, or the CDC one time. For advice. It's not who we call. So to have them dictate our medical practices has to stop. It should not ever have been done. We've got to find a way to fight back. The public knows that hospitals are dangerous places, like Dr. Merrick said, and we've got to reinvent the wheel, basically, because our current system is the corporate practice of medicine telling doctors what to do when we already know what to do. There's a nuance, and we know it. Each and every patient has a slight potential thing that we might do differently. And if we don't do that, we are not good doctors.
You know, hospitals are not factories. Dr. Cariotti spoke very eloquently about that beautiful mystery of a patient and the phase of disease and illness and all their host of comorbidities and predilections and medicines. You know, it's a very complex problem that we have to solve. There is no standard solution. That push towards standardization that was beginning before COVID. hyper accelerated into some sort of totalitarian top-down control of the practice of medicine. Dr. Marek just spoke about it. The autonomy, the freedom, the liberty to make decisions using your decades of expertise and experience was removed. You were told to use this drug at this dose for this duration. I've never seen that happening. It's unprecedented.
The vaccines, all the vaccines in use in the United States and predominantly across the world, use genetic technologies that harness the body's own cells to produce the protein on the surface of the virus, the spike protein, which is acknowledged to be dangerous. This is the first time in human medicine that we have an uncontrolled exposure for an uncontrolled duration and quantity in the human body in a mosaic of cells. And to make matters worse, the vehicle that carries these genetic products into the human body goes into vital organs. And it's unprecedented that we've ever exposed a single human, let alone hundreds of millions of people, to this form of technology. We have just fulfilled the Bradford Hill tenets of causality, meaning, I am telling you as an epidemiologist, the vaccines are causing these fatal and non-fatal events to a large degree, and many of those skilled around the table, I'm sure, would agree.
We've got 3 whistleblowers who've given me permission at this point to share their name. Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Teresa Long, DO MPH, Dr. Samuel Sigloff, and Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Peter Chambers, DO and Flight Surgeon. All 3 have given me this data. I have declarations from all 3. This data is under penalty. This is under penalty of perjury. We intend to submit this to the courts. We have substantial data showing that we saw, for example, miscarriages increased by 300% over the 5-year average, almost. We saw almost 300% increase in cancer over the 5-year average. Cancer is not being talked about except for by Dr. Ryan Cole. Thank you, doctor. We saw, this one's amazing, neurological. So neurological issues which would affect our pilots. Over 1,000% increase. 1,000.
10 times. That's 10 times the rate, and obviously that
83,000 per year, 82,000 per year to 863,000 in 1 year. Our soldiers are being experimented on, injured, and sometimes possibly killed. Dr. Corey, thank you so much for your stance on the corruption. That's precisely what it is. They know this. And Senator, when these doctors are attacked, not necessarily the people in this room, I'm not giving names, they call me. I'm the one dealing with the medical boards. I'm the one watching the witch hunts. I'm the one fighting them off, and I'm the one telling them where to go. I'm going to keep doing that. Senator, we also have, let me give you this last thing, and then I'll shut up and get out of your way. 9/28/2021. Project Salus weekly report. Project Salus is a Defense Department initiative where they report and they take all this data that doesn't exist supposedly, and they give it to the CDC. They're watching these vaccines. On that date, and around that date, I have numerous instances where Fauci and that entire crew were saying, it's a crisis of unvaxxed. It's 99% unvaxxed in the hospital. In Project Salus, in the weekly report, the DOD document, says specifically 71% of new cases are in the fully vaxxed and 60% of hospitalizations are in the fully vaxxed. This is corruption at the highest level. We need investigations. The Secretary of Defense needs investigated. The CDC needs to investigated. And thank you so much, Senator, for having the courage to stand against these special interests.
I am seeing an uptick in cancers. I'm seeing these odd, stable cancers take off like wildfires after the vaccines. We have bad cells in our body every day. Our body says, oh, I can kill that, knock it off, shakes hands with every cell. You're gone, you're a bad cell. There are genes, there are suppressor genes, P53, it's the guardian of our genome. There's another breast cancer gene, BRCA gene. We know that the spike protein binds to the receptors for these genes and can activate them. That is a mechanism of the spike protein. So putting this spike protein in the human body via a a gene shot that is completely investigational. These are not approved. And to mandate something that's investigational that can bind to cancer-promoting sites.
I'd like to just clarify and take that a step forward. Because what P53 does is it checks your DNA
Yes.
before it replicates, and it makes sure that it's fixed. So P53 is the one tumor suppressor gene that is most tied to cancer, because once there's a mutation in P53, the mutation rate just skyrockets.
Correct.
And you're going to develop enough mutations that cancer is going to have a much more likelihood of becoming metastatic.
Absolutely
So
correct.
P53 is the essential tumor suppressor. Now, do we know for sure that the spike protein is binding it and inactivating it so that it cannot make sure that your DNA is replicated effectively and without any errors? No, but that's why we should have tested these for cancer-causing potential before we started giving them to our kids.
There are great unknowns with respect to the vaccines, their mechanism of action, and disease categories like cancer. But there is a disease category upon which the FDA, the CDC, and all stakeholders agree that the vaccines cause, and that's myocarditis or heart inflammation. And I will tell you, as a cardiologist, it is crystal clear that these vaccines cause myocarditis. There are papers by Schauer and now by Trong at University of Utah at Salt Lake. When they do MRI on these individuals with suspected myocarditis, 100% are having heart damage.
I would contend, Senator, that there's not just a suspicion. In August, when the report was run on acute myocarditis in the DoD website, there were 1,239 cases, and now when you run it, it's down to 307. In January of 2022, there were 176 cases, and magically, they are now down to 17. There is a word for that. It's not suspicious. We have in the military the single best data set that exists because we have baselines in there. And acute disease across all categories in the preceding years, 5 years leading up to the vaccination year, was 1.7 million. They introduced and mandated a COVID-19 vaccine for our U.S. military when they had only lost 12 service members total to the disease. And in the 10 months of 2021 after that, it jumped from 1.7 million, all diseases, to darn near 22 million. That was a 20 million increase. We need to not be calling this suspicious. With all due respect, we need to be asking hard questions of the DoD.
This is what we get when I investigate. We know the nanolipid particle. And it also goes through some of these very difficult permeable barriers. For example, the brain. Or
Yeah, I want to ask Dr. Malone that question. Because I worked with lipid nanoparticles for chemotherapy. They are like garlic. They go everywhere. They can they can slip through a door crack. They go through very tight junctions. That's what they do. That's why when I first saw the technology, I knew it was going to end up in the brain, because that's one of the things they were doing, was trying to find lipid nanoparticles to carry chemotherapeutic agents.
Talk about the concern about it getting into the brain.
Well, that was the actual original design for lipid nanoparticles, to be used in chemotherapy, because in order to direct chemotherapy to the brain, it's very difficult. So they were going to use lipid nanoparticles to do it. The problem was the lipid nanoparticles went into ovaries, bone marrow, adrenal glands, and other tissues. So it's still being worked on. Studies are still being done. But I was going to ask Dr. Malone, because Dr. McCullough had just talked about the fact that he has concerns. Do you have concerns for this vaccine in children, knowing that it's going in the brain, the bone marrow, the adrenals, and all these other organs?
So the answer is yes. Well, I do have some credibility here because I did create this technology. I do know in detail. I can speak.
But you don't work for the CDC, NIH, and FDA.
No, I actually work for the DoD from time to time. We are clearly seeing not only specific effects associated with spike protein, but non-specific effects associated with the lipid-nanocomplexes at the 100 microgram dose, which is the dose that's used in the emergency use authorized vaccines. 90% of the subjects had adverse events compared to 30% in the placebo group. This is phase 1 data. Now, that data has not been disclosed publicly. It was only disclosed to their stockholders. But what it clearly demonstrates is that the cationic lipid RNA complexes have intrinsic toxicity above and beyond just that associated with the spikes. They did demonstrate that these lipid nanoparticles go all over the body, just as Richard is saying. And oddly, they seem to differentially go to ovaries and bone marrow, but ovaries relative to testes. And it's important everybody kind of latches onto this and they say, oh, there's spike protein in the ovaries. No, that's not what they measured. They didn't ever measure spike protein. What they measured was the lipid component, these synthetic lipids, which is the other thing you didn't mention in this cocktail, okay? These synthetic lipids go to ovaries. Now, who cares? Well, when your child is born, when your daughter is born, she has all the eggs she's ever going to have in her ovaries. And we do know that, and the CDC now finally acknowledges, after women all over the world complaining about their altered menses and getting, I mean, I felt like I was in the mid 20th century. It was attributed to hysteria, much as your own story. These alterations in menstruation were believed to represent hysterical women.
I didn't see a single patient died of COVID. I've seen a substantial number of patients die of negligence and medical malfeasance. I've had patients that haven't been bathed, haven't been fed, haven't been given water, haven't been turned. And if you ask me, this isn't a hospital, this is a concentration camp.